Thank you very much. We're trying to keep you alive after the lunch break. It's about, as you said, it's about regulatory compliance, and in particular how to use cloud-based data and how to integrate the data into product development to make automation of regulatory compliance. We have the food industry has burdens, and we have customers that have burdens. Few of them are how to interact with different people within the organization, but also outside the organization. And I'm focusing more on when you want to develop and innovate on a new product. How you integrate the processes and how you access the great number of the huge information about the product. For me, it's about having the right information accessible to the relevant person at the right time. But just to illustrate what I said previously, and we said that it's very complicated to get a safe and compliant product. You will have to integrate processes and procedures like HACCP or good practices that you put in place to prevent contamination. You need to integrate different functions of the companies, sales and marketing, dealing more with product positioning, or regulatory affairs, dealing more with regulatory requirements, but you have also R&D and sometimes also procurement and quality control that needs to access the information on the product. And on top of that, you need to master, when you build the new product, it's not just about the technicality of the product, having the champion. It's about having the compliant champion. So you need to deal with an enormous amount of regulatory data, in particular if you work across markets. And when you want to know food additive conditions of use or contaminant residues in food and so on, for many countries you will have many sources of information, many languages to be managed. You need to access the information. Sometimes it's on the web, sometimes it's on paper, so it becomes complicated. What we have thought is a cloud solution. And more than cloud, I will talk about clouding, which is the basic principle is outsourcing. No? But our definition of clouding is outsourcing those tedious tasks, collecting, monitoring, classifying, structuring the information related to regulatory data to support the regulatory compliance processes. It means that if we can provide that solution to our customers, they can dedicate more time to key activities. And we call it the Selerant Compliance Cloud, what it is. It's a huge database composed by different elements. We will come back to that. Legislation, document, data from the legislation, food additive conditions of use, pesticide residues in food, microbiological criteria, labeling rules, and so on. And we have regulatory experts and food scientists reading that legislation, extracting the relevant data, and structuring that into our data model. We also provide news every time there is an amendment, every time there's a new Chinese standard or a new pesticide tolerance. And we publish that also in our database. And we also process a lot of information to get those news and database of food alerts and recalls to provide readily accessible information to our customers. So we really structure the data, we classify, we transform the data, but not too much to keep the legislation not interpreted by us, by our team, and we build what we call the reg data. That's a huge database containing the data from the legislation, news, recalls, and alerts. And that's the Selerant Compliance Cloud. Now we have different kinds of users. There's the simpler one is a user B can connect online to the Selerant Compliance Cloud and access all this data for search, for queries, reports, and so on. The second type of user is the user that is already working, because the added value is not having a searchable database. There are many searchable databases. The added value is how we can, because we structure the data in a way we can integrate that into the new product development process. What makes the added value is when you want to create a new product, you want your product to be compliant. You don't want to wait the end of the development phase and get your product developer coming back to you and say, I've got the champion. And then you say, it's a champion, but it's not compliant. It cannot be on the market. So we integrate directly the Selerant Compliance Cloud into ERP, into LIMS, or product lifecycle management software to provide what I used to call the magic button that you press. The system will screen your formula, your ingredients, and will return you a compliance report based on the data from the legislation. The type of data, we can divide the type of data. We have the regulatory data into three main types. The first one are legislation limits. As I said, food conditions of use, food additive conditions of use, the contaminants and vet drugs and pesticides residues in food, microbiological criteria, or food contact materials. We also work on global labeling rules, because each country will have its own set of nutrients to be declared with a declarable name, with specific rounding rules to be applied on the label, nutrition claims, daily values, and so on. And we also provide to our community regularly food news that can be interesting for them to know on the legislation we are covering and monitoring. We provide also information about scientific reports or risk assessments for non-regulatory body, I would say, and also collection of food recalls and alerts. Yeah, that's a question that comes often, how we can guarantee the quality of the data. So that's our process. Basically, what we do when we start working on regulatory data, we do what we call the legislation analysis. That's a way for us to understand and to publish also this understanding on who is regulating what, when, where, and how. Where you can find the document, what's the regulatory body, how you can navigate into the legislation of one country. From that legislation analysis, then we draw an exhaustive list of all the regulations in force that we will be using for data collection and maintenance. Then we have our validation process, because we extract the data to put it in a database format. And we also always provide the original documents. So we work in English. We try to provide all the official languages of the legislation, but always English. We follow a stringent processes. Our role is really not to make any interpretation to the legislation. That, I believe, it's the role of our customers to finally interpret the data based on a product and based on a market. But we provide accurate data. We structure them trying to mirror the legislation as much as we can, and we extract any information we think could be useful for the final interpretation of the, let's say, the limit or the chemical limit. Selerant is not a regulatory company. It's originally a company that provides software and is renowned for regulatory software, but since several years we have we have created this internal expertise in regulatory and scientific affairs. So that's the merge of the two. And I like to say that we, inside Selerant, we speak different languages. And I'm not talking about Chinese, French, or English. I'm talking about legislation and IT, and how we make that merge between how to put the data in a format that can be used with an added value for our customers, for search, and also for automated compliance evaluation. So I will show you some key features of the Selerant Compliance Cloud. The first one is how you can navigate into regulatory data. It's easy to use. You just request a login, credentials, and you log in. You select the country for which you want to see a regulatory data. You select your food category or product category. If you are searching for a food additive, you can input the name of the food additive or its functional class and search by this. If you are looking for a pesticide, you can use the pesticides or international recognized international numbering system like INS for additives. And an interesting feature is you can save your search. You can save the search and request to have any update on that particular search, because we are constantly monitoring the legislation, and the legislation is constantly moving. Just to give you an example for pesticides, it's about pesticide residues in food, it's about 1 amendment per week for only one country. So it's huge. In that case, if you select, do you want updates on your search, next time you connect to the Selerant Compliance Cloud, you would get an alert if there is an update affecting your product category or the countries you were searching for. So you know there is an update from the legislation and you need to check the compliance. The system will return you the output, so basically a summary of the criteria you have input and a synopsis of the different matches found for your criteria. You will have a summary of the legislations with notes and official documents to refer to, with also date of entry into force of the legislation. And you will find the limits for your product category and for the substances or the chemicals you were looking for. If we take this regulatory database, the real added value is when you integrate that into your formulation. If you take this and you remember the burden, you can integrate your processes and procedures inside a tool that can be a PLM or ERP, and you integrate from end to end to the project ID to the final bill of material. You integrate all your different processes and workflow. Now if you integrate inside a tool like the Selerant Compliance Cloud, you get additional advantages. You have in a central source of information of your regulatory data that you can couple with your corporate standards or customers' requirements, and you can conduct and control your regulatory compliance from the initial stage of the product development. You can start your product requirement, you know what you want to do, you know where you want to sell it, you know already what are the regulatory requirements you need to meet, and you can attach that to the project before even formulating. Then while you formulate, the system makes available to the product developer a compliance functionality that will screen the formula and return you a compliance report. So that's very useful for development teams, but also for regulatory teams for the final assessment. And when we are talking about contaminants, pesticides, residues, it's also very useful for compliance of raw materials and of the analytical testing that you can do on the raw material. And the concept is this one. Your process, your development process is based on, you do a formula. If you integrate the compliance cloud, we put the legislation into objects, which we call guidelines, that are linked to some of the added substances, like food additives. Let me check. And those data attached to the food additives are immediately screened based on the composition of your formula. I'm sorry, I cannot go back. The computer seems blocked. Huh? Let me see if I can move forward, at least. So basically, when you build your formula, and you want to check, this is the example of food additive compliance evaluation. Your formula will contain some ingredients, and okay. So your formula is at the very start of the process. You want to check the food additive composition if you are compliant for different markets. So basically, you run that magic button, and from that moment, what you need to do is inform the system when you want the product to be on the market, what are your markets, and what is the product category. And then you get a compliance report, ingredient by ingredient, whether your food additives inside your formula are compliant with the different rules of the different markets. So I'm not a formula developer, so I don't want you to look at the formulation, but this is a cheese with 2 additives. Let's make an example. I want to sell this cheese in Canada, US, and I want to check that if that formula is compliant with Codex standards. So what I do, I go in the tool, put regulatory calculation, select global food additives, and click next. And here I input the date on which I want the product to be on the market. I indicate the markets. And I position my product based on the category. It's a cheese. I click finish, and I get a report with a color code indication whether my ingredients might have a compliance issue. So that's very useful for different people in the organization. Another example is for cashew. You might have different standards giving you different physical or chemical properties. And you might have different values. This is, if I remember, I don't read Chinese, but if I remember well, it's peroxide, but you will correct me. You might have different values based on the standard. What such system can do is calculate the most restrictive, or the one you want to apply in this case, and you set that into the compliance cloud. That's your database. Your standard gives you values for different, let's call, properties. Then when you come to your raw material management, you build your spec. You receive from your vendor some values for the different characteristics, and you store them in your system, and you might also, for some of them, do an analytical testing. So from that moment, what the system can do is compare the different characteristics with the one you have set up as a reference, and indicate you whether you are within the spec or out of spec. So that was just a few examples of how you can integrate regulatory data into your product development and NPLM tool. Another feature of the Selerant Compliance Cloud are the news, alerts, and food recall. This is the kind of information you can find. So we publish regularly news on what we think is relevant for our customers to know, and we classify them by category, by tag or country, and the user can search for particular news for a particular country or for a particular subject. And we also fetch an enormous amount of data all over the world from many sites that we classify to provide this information to our customers on the cloud. So we can have legislation sources, so official legislation document. We can have risk assessment or scientific reports. And what we do is we provide that information in a way that it is also possible for our users to set their own queries. If one is interested only in, I don't know, Taiwan contaminant and wants to know everything that is published on Taiwan contaminant, then set the query inside the system and receive the news he or she is interested in. So that's the advanced search on food, and we also have a huge database on the food alerts and food recall. That all this information, the news, will be searchable by category, by substance. You wonder what has been published on melamine or citric acid for all countries, or you want to specifically address one country. This is something that is possible also from that database, because there's everything together in a central point. The cloud is operational on the web. You have the address here. What I can do is just recommend you have a look. You can register. There's a free trial that is possible. For those who are really interested, if you come back to me today, tomorrow, unfortunately, I will not be here, but I will have some colleagues here in the conference. We can arrange to get you a free access for about 1 month. But there is already a free trial available on the website for few queries. But please, if you are really interested, then we can put you an additional access to try.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I remember a few years ago, actually many years ago, one of my bosses said to me, Guy, if you have access to data, you can get the power and you can get the knowledge. And that is really important, you know, to get access to information. We know that time to market is really important. Shorter you can be, better you can get competitive edge and market share. We know that the cost of non-compliance, if we have to recall the product, withdraw the product, change the packaging. So being sure that every product that is being developed can comply with the regulation which is enforced somewhere in the world, mainly for global companies, that can create huge added value. So, thank you for this great presentation. We know that if we want to get access to data, we can get the power, but we can get through your system. Thank you for your presentation. I guess if anyone has any question, I guess you're going to be pleased to answer everything you always wanted to know about the system. Access to data. No questions so far? So I guess you can get access to the site and you can get all the information. I heard that we can get a free trial. I'm going to try this evening, right?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. A big round of applause. Thank you.